On a damp Wednesday evening, the Flaxborough Literary and Debating Society gathered in the church hall to consider, with its usual air of mild self-congratulation, the topic of moral progress in the 20th century. The audience consisted largely of the same dozen or so souls who could be relied upon to attend anything with chairs and tepid tea. There was Mrs. Dewhurst, whose moral progress began and ended with her new curtains. Mr. Clegg, retired draper and amateur philosopher, and Miss Teal, who attended for the biscuits and the chance to correct people's quotations from Milton. The guest speaker was Mr. Lionel Pettifer, B.A., headmaster of Flaxborough Grammar School. His views on morality were as firm and tidy as his moustache. He had, he informed his listeners, been asked to address the society because of his long acquaintance with the moral fibre of youth. That phrase caused a ripple of polite amusement, swiftly smothered beneath the thick flannel of rural discretion. At precisely 8:17 p.m., while Mr. Pettifer was drawing a cautious distinction between ethics and etiquette, the church hall's clock gave a muffled cough and stopped. 5 minutes later, so did Mr. Pettifer. He paused mid-sentence, frowned faintly, then tilted sideways in a manner too unliterary for the occasion. His notes fluttered to the floor. Mrs. Dewhurst, ever practical, said, "He's fainted, poor man," though her tone suggested mild disapproval of the timing. Reverend Copeland bent over the prostrate headmaster, adjusted his spectacles and murmured, "No pulse." Then, as though aware that his words might be taken as criticism, added quickly, "None at all." By the time the ambulance arrived, which in Flaxborough meant 20 minutes and 2 wrong turns, the audience had already reached a consensus: stress, overwork, or possibly the sandwiches. Only Miss Teal, who had fetched the man's briefcase for safekeeping, noted aloud that the smell of almonds seemed unusually strong for a church hall. By the following morning, every shopkeeper between the market square and the police station had a version. In one, Pettifer had been found clutching a confession. In another, he had been warned off by the Education Committee for knowing too much about council procurement. A third, preferred by the ladies of the Cooperative Guild, involved a woman from Lincoln. Inspector Purbright, whose experience of human fancy was extensive, received the news without visible emotion. He had, at the time, been engaged in the delicate task of pruning his geraniums on the windowsill of his office. "Poison, you think?" asked Sergeant Love, entering with the brisk uncertainty of a man who knew he was about to learn something unpleasant. Purbright looked out at the drizzle veiling the square. "I think," he said mildly, "Mr. Pettifer was not the sort of man to do anything as sudden as dying without first considering the effect on the timetable." The post-mortem, conducted that afternoon, confirmed Miss Teal's unintentional astuteness. Mr. Pettifer had ingested cyanide, a deliberate, precise dose. Suicide was possible, accident improbable, murder in Flaxborough unthinkable but not unprecedented. Purbright's attention, however, fixed not on the poison but on what was missing. Among the headmaster's possessions, briefcase, lecture notes, reading glasses, there was no fountain pen. According to Miss Teal, he had been scribbling corrections before his speech. According to Sergeant Love, there were ink smudges on his right thumb. "It may be nothing," said Purbright, turning the thought over like a pebble. "But then most things begin that way." By Thursday afternoon, Flaxborough had settled into the kind of communal agitation that passed for excitement. The notice board outside the post office displayed its usual collection of parish notices, dog sales, and faded adverts for piano lessons, but now drew small clusters of readers who pretended to be interested in the Rotary Club raffle while quietly discussing Mr. Pettifer's abrupt demise. The theory most in favor was that he had taken his own life due to pressure. Precisely what kind of pressure was never defined, but implied a complicated moral failure that absolved the speaker from knowing details. At the police station, Inspector Purbright listened patiently to Sergeant Love's summary of the situation. The sergeant, whose enthusiasm often galloped ahead of his reasoning, had prepared a notebook full of speculations. "There's talk, sir," he began, "that Pettifer was seen with one of his sixth-form boys on Tuesday evening, walking near the canal, apparently." Purbright regarded him mildly. "Talk, you say? Would this be the sort of talk that begins in the snug of the King's Arms and ends in the co-op queue?" Love flushed slightly. "It might have come through those channels, sir. Yes." "Then we must assume it has undergone the usual filtration," Purbright said. "We shall, however, note it. Have you spoken with the staff at the grammar school?" "Just the deputy head, Mr. Crabbe. Said Pettifer was rather a strict man, but respected. Didn't notice anything unusual." Purbright leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "No one ever does, Sergeant. Unusual things tend to appear ordinary until someone stops breathing." The inspector's office window overlooked the square, and through its rain-blurred glass, he could see Mrs. Dewhurst's umbrella bobbing purposefully towards the police station. Moments later, she appeared in the doorway, resolute, gloved, and carrying a parcel of moral authority. "I won't keep you a moment, Inspector," she declared, "but I felt it my duty to inform you that I distinctly heard Mr. Pettifer arguing with someone before the meeting, in the church hall, corridor, just before he went in to speak. A woman, it was." "Ah?" Purbright rose slightly from his chair, half in courtesy, half in curiosity. "And did you recognize this woman?" "I couldn't see her, Inspector. The door was half closed, but I am quite certain it was a woman's voice. Sharp, you know, like someone trying to be polite but not managing it. She said something about a letter. He told her it was too late for that." Purbright inclined his head. "You have a good memory, Mrs. Dewhurst." "Well, one must," she said primly. "Otherwise, how would one tell truth from rumor?" When she had gone, Sergeant Love scribbled furiously in his notebook. "So, that could be our woman from Lincoln," he murmured. "It could," said Purbright. "Or it could be Mrs. Dewhurst rehearsing a better story for tomorrow's cue." Still, the mention of a letter had pricked his interest. That evening he asked the constable on duty to search Pettifer's briefcase again. No letter was found, only a timetable, a staff meeting agenda, and a single sheet of lined paper torn neatly from a notebook. On it were 3 words, written in Pettifer's careful hand. "Midnight. Don't delay." The following morning, Purbright walked to the grammar school under a sullen sky that promised rain but delivered only humidity. The corridor smelled faintly of chalk and adolescent fear. Mr. Crabbe, the deputy head, was a small, efficient man who spoke as though apologizing for every vowel. He showed Purbright into Pettifer's study, a room whose orderliness felt more like suppression than tidiness. "I can't imagine what could have possessed him," Crabbe said, perching on the edge of a chair. "He was so methodical. His life was his timetable, nothing spontaneous about him at all." Purbright examined the desk. Inkwell, ruler, blotter, perfectly squared papers. He noticed a slight indentation in the blotter's corner, as if a fountain pen had rested there habitually, and recently. "He was missing a pen," the inspector remarked. "A Parker, according to the school secretary." Crabbe looked blank. "Oh yes, he did carry one. Gold nib. A retirement gift, I think, from his last post. He was very particular about it." "Indeed." Purbright's eyes travelled to the bookshelf, where the neat ranks of classical authors were interrupted by a single modern title, Ethics in Practice. He pulled it out. Between its pages, a faint brownish smudge marked the edge. Ink, perhaps, or something else. He replaced it without comment. Back at the station, Love awaited him with news. "The pathologist rang, sir. There were traces of cyanide residue on Pettifer's fingertips. Not much, but definite." Purbright nodded slowly. "Which suggests he handled it himself, or was helped by someone considerate enough not to spill." The sergeant frowned. Could have been in a drink, sir. The tea urn at the church hall? Maybe. Possibly. Though if so, others might have joined him in eternity. And I imagine Miss Teal would have mentioned any fatalities among the audience. They sat for a moment in companionable silence, each pursuing his own thought. Then Purbright said, "I think we should speak with Miss Teal. People who notice smells of almonds tend also to notice other things." Miss Teal received them in her cottage, surrounded by stacked magazines and the faint odor of cats. She was delighted to be consulted. "I knew it wasn't right," she said, nodding vigorously. He was twitchy, fidgeting with his hands, and when he dropped his papers, I saw there was a little glass vial that rolled under the table. I thought it was smelling salts, but then, well, he was beyond smelling anything. Purbright's gaze sharpened. "You saw this vial clearly?" "Oh, yes. I'd have picked it up myself, but the Reverend told me not to. Said it was unseemly." When she described it, a small clear tube with a silver cap, Purbright made a note. "Thank you, Miss Teal. You've been most helpful." As they walked back to the car, Love looked puzzled. "So, suicide then? He took it himself before the talk?" Purbright glanced towards the darkening spire of the church, where the clock had resumed its unhurried ticking. "Perhaps. But if Mr. Pettifer intended to die, I wonder why he bothered to bring a briefcase, prepare his speech, and write, 'Midnight, don't delay.'" He paused, looking thoughtful. A man planning his end is rarely punctual. By the time Friday's bells labored through 10 o'clock, Purbright had decided that the church hall corridor, narrow, draughty, and upholstered in parish notices, was more promising than the lecture dais. He and Sergeant Love found the Reverend Copeland there with a feather duster and a conscience. The vicar, who had the air of a man apologizing for his architecture, indicated where Pettifer had waited before going on. "He paced," Copeland said, dusting the skirting with ecclesiastical resignation. "Quite unlike him. One could almost hear the timetable slipping." He did not remember a woman's voice, but admitted that rectors are not granted the hearing of Mrs. Dewhurst. "I was in the vestry, rehearsing my introduction," he explained. "An introduction that will now never be heard, and will therefore be much improved in memory." Purbright stooped at the knotty floorboards. A faint oval of scuffing lay at ankle height on the wall, as if a handbag had brushed repeatedly. "We shall accept Mrs. Dewhurst's ear," he said mildly. "And your wall." The vicar brightened as if absolved. The caretaker, Mr. Hasker, arrived with keys the size of moral precepts. He was one of those men who regard police inquiries as personal affronts to their polishing. "No vial," he said at once, before he had been asked. "Not under the chairs, not behind the lectern, not anywhere a decent vial would choose to be." His suspicion of invisible objects was total. "As for cups, I washed them, each and every, no foreign smells." He said this with the pride of a man whose life opposed foreignness. Love, taking notes in his thick, honest hand, ventured, "Did Mr. Pettifer bring a thermos, or ask for water separate from the urn?" "Brought nothing but his briefcase and importance," Hasker declared. "If there was poison, sir, it wasn't on my premises." He folded his arms as if barricading the hall against chemical attack. Outside, in a square glazed with rain, Purbright paused. "A vial seen and then not found," he murmured. "An argument heard by one ear, yet not another. A note promising midnight from a man who died at 8:22. Either he changed his mind or someone changed it for him." Love looked dogged. "Midnight could be a meeting, sir. Perhaps he meant to see someone after the lecture." "Quite possibly," said Purbright. "It has the sound of a tryst, though trysts tend not to be written in one's own careful hand, unless one is confident the reader is oneself." They walked to the grammar school again, where the secretary, Mrs. Plummer, sensible shoes, sensible lipstick, regarded the inspector with a professional mixture of curiosity and scorn for disorder. She confirmed the existence of the Parker pen. He kept it on a little stand, she said, like a ship moored to a harbour. If it wasn't there, he fretted. Her glance flicked to the empty desk. He fretted yesterday. Who had access to his study? Asked Purbright. Well, Mrs. Plummer replied, counting on invisible beads. Myself, obviously. Mr. Crabbe, the cleaners. The pigeonhole area is through that door. Boys sometimes hover, but they don't come in unless summoned, and any parent who mistook authority for invitation. Parents have been known to do that, Purbright allowed. Would you be so good as to tell me the names of any mothers likely to take the corridor by storm? Mrs. Plummer considered. Mrs. Beamish came Tuesday about her son's literary potential, which I gather is a euphemism for not doing any work. And Mrs. Milner last week complaining of detentions. Oh, and Mrs. Hesketh, the music teacher's wife. She left a letter. Private, she said. Did he mention it? He put it in his drawer, Mrs. Plummer said crisply, then took it out again and put it in his pocket. I noticed because the pocket already contained his handkerchief, and he did not approve of bulges. Tuesday? Asked Purbright. Wednesday, she said. Afternoon. They thanked her and found Mr. Crabbe moving through the corridor like a conscientious moth. The deputy head wore his grief like a borrowed suit, one size too demonstrative. Terrible business, he began, before Purbright could speak. The boys are unsettled. We're arranging an assembly. He bowed, smiled with managerial sorrow. Continuity is everything. Quite, said Purbright. Continuity and ink. Did Mr. Pettifer ever leave bottles of chemicals about? For the laboratory, perhaps? Good heavens, no, Crabbe said, surprised into sincerity. He was terrified of the lab. Once he described sulfuric acid as indiscreet. He did keep that pen ink, though. Blue-black, it stains. Crabbe glanced at his own fingers, as if checking his innocence by cuticle. Thank you, said Purbright. As they turned away, he added, almost lazily, By the way, Mr. Crabbe, did you happen to hear a woman's voice in the church hall corridor on Wednesday evening? Crabbe's face arranged itself into a suitable recollection. A woman. No, well, there were many people, of course. Mrs. Dewhurst is very audible. She breathes like an opinion. When they were outside, Love muttered, He's slippery. Only because he oils himself with earnestness, said Purbright. It keeps the conscience supple. They lunched at the King's Arms, where the landlady supplied soup and information in equal measures. Headmaster was here Tuesday night, she confided, ladling barley with the solemnity of a coronation. Sat in the snug with Mrs. Hesketh, music teacher's wife, quiet-like. He had a bitter, she had a small sherry that didn't stay small. The landlady's eyebrows climbed their ladder of insinuation. I thought they were talking about the school concert, but she cried a bit, dabbing, you know, as if sorrow were makeup. Did they leave together? Asked Purbright. No, she said. He went first. She waited, then took a cab. Outside, the rain had finally made good its threats. They walked under its steady instruction to the Hesketh's small semi, where a piano in the bay window glowered at the street like a black civilized animal. Mrs. Hesketh opened the door with the resigned composure of a woman who has rehearsed several versions of the truth and found each wanting. She was pale, stylish in a way that owed more to effort than money, and braver than her lipstick. Yes, she said, before introductions had fully finished. I met Mr. Pettifer on Tuesday. Yes, I left him a letter on Wednesday. No, I didn't poison him. It was an economical overture. Purbright inclined his head. We are grateful for the clarity, madam. May I ask the letter's subject? She folded her arms. My husband's position. He's to be made redundant at term's end. Budget rationalizations. Mr. Pettifer called it unfortunate, but necessary. I called it betrayal. That's the gist. Was there anything in the letter that could be construed as a threat? If a plea for decency is a threat, she said with a small and wry bend of the mouth, then yes. And Wednesday night? Purbright asked gently. Were you at the church hall? I was, she said. I asked him if he'd reconsider. He said it was too late. I may have raised my voice. She managed a smile so thin it would not have cut butter. I am not from Lincoln, Inspector, but I might as well be. In this town, indignation is an imported luxury. Thank you, said Purbright. He observed the piano's open lid, the metronome set at an obstinate andante. On the music stand lay a hymn tune and, tucked beneath, a small silver-capped glass vial. He did not look at it for more than a fraction of a second. That was sufficient for certainty. He asked her instead, "Did you by any chance give Mr. Pettifer a fountain pen?" She blinked. "A pen? No." "Forgive me," Purbright said, retreating with courtesy. In the street, Love whispered, "Sir, the vial." "Yes," said Purbright, buttoning his coat. "She has one, which might mean she had another, or that she collects them, or that she would like us to think so. At any rate, we have met our first obvious suspect. We should make sure she knows it." He watched the rain weave its net across the pavement. Guilt and innocence both dislike attention. We shall see which flinches first. Saturday morning brought the kind of watery light that makes even fresh paint look remorseful. Purbright, who had never trusted weather to be meaningful, trusted it now to keep people indoors where their stories were easier to collect. He asked Love to bring in Mrs. Hesketh for a chat, which the sergeant delivered in the manner of a summons softened by the teapot. She arrived without fuss, handbag compressed under her arm like a secret she had talked out of, and took the station chair with a pianist's straight back as if posture could acquit character. "You left Mr. Pettifer a letter," Purbright began, placing his notes in a modest stack. "Wednesday afternoon. We know because your frankness has preempted triumph." "I left a plea," she replied, meeting him with a levelness that was almost conversational. "He put my husband on a list. I asked him to take him off. And Tuesday evening at the King's Arms. An unwise attempt to be persuasive over sherry," she said. I cried. He listened. The world continued. Love, who dreaded tears as a species of gas attack, stared dutifully at the mantel clock. Purbright allowed a small pause. "You were at the church hall on Wednesday. You spoke to him." Mrs. Dewhurst, who hears through doors as others do through stethoscopes, remembers a letter being mentioned. Then Mrs. Dewhurst, for once, reports accurately. A fractional sigh escaped her. I asked if he'd read it. He said it was too late. I said it couldn't be. That is the sum. Purbright's gaze drifted, apparently idly, to the handbag's brass clasp. A narrow crescent of polish had been rubbed pale around it by repeated friction. He remembered the oval scuff on the corridor wall at just that height. "Do you often carry this bag to the church, Hall?" he asked, as if inquiring about a hymn book. "It is the one bag I own that does not squeak," she said. "I am not, Inspector, a woman of accessories." "And the small vial on your piano?" "Valerian," she said promptly. "For nerves. The cap is silver because I am vain. Cheaply. May I?" He did not wait for consent, which would only have made refusal awkward, and lifted the vial, feeling the tack of its threads. It opened with the reluctant pop of an object too long closed. He replaced it at once. "You see, Sergeant," he murmured, not quite to her, "how even comfort can be sealed against curiosity." When she had gone under the promise of further trouble if required, Love rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Strong motive," he said. "Opportunity. Known contact. The vial. She's our man. If you'll pardon." "I am always ready to pardon grammar," said Purbright. "As for guilt, I prefer to postpone." He rose. "Let us call upon Mr. Hesketh. The music teacher, if you remember, is the piece of furniture in this arrangement upon which the others have been leaning." They found Mr. Hesketh in the school's music room, coaxing a hymn from reluctant boys who treated pitch as a suggestion. He was a neat, grey man whose smile had long ago been tuned to apology. When the boys had tumbled out, he turned to them with polite fatigue. "My wife has already been frank, I expect," he said before they asked. She's very good at being frank. It is one of her several virtues. Redundancy at term's end, Purbright said. Yes. He looked not angry but bereaved. I am to be rationalized, as if I were an equation. He took a cloth to the piano keys with domestic care. Mr. Pettifer told me himself. He had the decency not to delegate his cruelty. You saw him Wednesday? In passing, before the lecture began. He was in the corridor with Councillor Beamish, who wanted a signature for some committee nonsense. Beamish had forgotten his pen, as he forgets most things that are not about him. Pettifer lent his. A faint frown creased the musician's forehead. I remember because I once admired that pen. A Parker. It writes like a violin bow's, he said. And after the signature, Beamish drifted away. A woman stopped Pettifer. I did not observe her. The bell rang for the start. I went into the hall. He hesitated, then added, almost absently, the church clock had stopped again. It has a sense of drama. This, offered as gossip, lodged in Purbright like grit. They thanked him and crossed the square to Beamish's shop, where the councillor sold hardware and opinions in roughly equal units. Beamish received them eagerly, as if a police inquiry were the right sort of advertisement. Terrible business, he boomed. I warned the man not to overtax himself. He was a strenuous sort, always improving something. On Wednesday, Purbright said. You asked him for a signature. Raffle permit, Beamish nodded. Funds for the cricket pavilion's roof, leaks when it rains and when it doesn't. I had mislaid my pen. Mrs. Beamish tidies without mercy, so he produced his fancy Parker. Very smooth. I signed on the vestry table. He demonstrated, wrist flourish and all. Handed it back, only there was a lady, hat with a little feather, waiting to grab him. He turned to her. The pen stayed in my hand. I said, "Excuse me." And she, well, took it as though it were hers, popped it into her bag and marched him off. I called after, but you know how ladies are, Inspector, purposeful. A hat with a feather, said Purbright. Not Mrs. Hesketh, then. Never seen her in feathers, Beamish declared with the authority of a man who has inspected all hats. This one was, you know, the sort that suggests a committee. Thank you, said Purbright. In the street, Love whistled softly. Someone else had the pen, and maybe the vial. Or a substitute, said Purbright. People who are very sure of what they saw are often sure of other things, too. He steered them back to the church hall, where the corridor waited with the meekness of a witness who easily offends. On the notice board, a clean sheet had been pinned that morning. The Mothers' Union Whist Drive. Its lower corner bore a small, irregular blot, blue-black, elliptical, just where a nib might leave a kiss when a hand pauses to listen to a voice. Purbright touched the paper lightly. The stain had dried with a faint crust. He looked along the skirting to the oval scuff, and, raising his gaze to the doorframe, saw another mark. A pale scrape like a hurried bag had glanced it. It was not much, the corridor's memory of a moment. Sir, said Love, bewildered by such fragmentary archaeology. Just the room telling us it was busy, Purbright said. We must be polite and let it finish. He went into the vestry. On the table lay a blotter, older than some of the congregation. In its corner, a fresh impression, the ghosts of letters written with a heavy, tidy hand. He angled it to the light and could just make out a downward stroke, then a dot. Not words, merely rhythm. He imagined Pettifer's pen moving, then stopping. On their way out, Mr. Hasker intercepted them with resignation. Found this behind the radiator, he announced, producing a glove. It was a fine, thin thing, off-white, the sort women wear when they plan to shake hands with rectitude. Inside the wrist, stitched in pale silk, an initial, T. Thank you, said Purbright, taking it like a gift from fate that had been wrapped badly. Outside, he looked towards the chemist's shop at the corner. "Let us call upon Mr. Lowstater," he said. "If one needed a little glass vial with a silver cap for nerves, or for show, where might one buy it in Flaxborough?" The chemist, who prided himself on supplying respectability with its subtler props, showed them a tray of sample bottles. "Silvered caps, very popular," he remarked, "for scents, drops, even ink in a pinch. Miss Teal buys them for potpourri oils. Mrs. Copeland insists on them for altar flowers. Says bear glass looks pagan." He paused, enjoying the harmless scandal. "And we keep the register for poisons." "Naturally. But there's nothing out of sorts this month, unless one counts a sudden run on almond essence for the W.I. bake." He smiled thinly. "Flavoring is very moral." They left with more knowledge than proof and stood in the damp noon. Love's patience, which had more stamina than agility, shuffled. "Where does that leave us, sir?" "In possession of a glove, an absent pen, and a corridor that remembers being crowded," said Purbright. "It also leaves us with midnight." He tapped the folded note in his pocket. "Don't delay," it says. "The dead seldom do. Those who keep them company sometimes must." The chemist's bell had scarcely stopped tinkling behind them when Purbright, with the air of a man testing a thought aloud, said, "Sergeant, one does not buy a silver-capped vial merely to be wicked. One buys it to appear respectable while doing something faintly unrespectable." Love trotted at his side, puzzled. "Meaning, sir?" "Meaning," Purbright replied, "that these vials seem to accompany the sort of activity one would rather scent than explain. People who bottle their anxieties or their vanities or their excuses. I wonder which our late headmaster bottled." The square was glistening, the cobbles dark with drizzle, and the few pedestrians moved as though reluctant to disturb the town's speculation. A group of women stood by the greengrocers, murmuring in tones of sanctified pity. The word poison floated audibly, followed by romance and grammar school. Gossip in Flaxborough could be relied upon to simplify motives while complicating facts. Back in his office, Purbright examined the glove found behind the radiator. The initial T was delicately embroidered, the work of a conscientious draper or a self-regarding lady. He turned it over between finger and thumb. "Do we know any T's, Sergeant?" "Teal," said Love promptly. "Miss Teal. She's got a cupboard full of vials, according to the chemist." "Indeed," murmured Purbright. "A woman of order, and order, when threatened, sometimes grows claws." He glanced at the clock. "We shall disturb her tea." Miss Teal opened her door with the brisk civility of one who has already dusted the hall twice. "Inspector, how efficient. I thought you might be along sooner." "You have anticipated us," Purbright said pleasantly. "One must in these times," she replied. "I've read enough detective novels to know that innocent people who don't speak up are the first to be arrested." She ushered them into a sitting room filled with magazines and the faint authority of lavender polish. "You mentioned, when we last met," Purbright said, "that you saw a vial roll under the table the night Mr. Pettifer died. Could you describe it again?" "Perfectly round, small as my thumb, silver top. I own several like it. Bought them from Mr. Lowstater." She gestured to a shelf of tidy bottles, each labeled in her fine hand. Eucalyptus, lavender, wintergreen. Household purposes. Nothing more sinister. Purbright smiled faintly. "We have no reason to suppose otherwise, though I am curious, Miss Teal. Do you embroider your initials on your gloves?" "Of course," she said, surprised. "One does if one expects to find them again after a concert or funeral. Practical habit. And these initials would be TT for Theodora Teal." She gave a small, self-conscious laugh. "People think it old-fashioned, but so am I." Purbright produced the glove. She examined it closely, then shook her head. "Not mine. Wrong thread. And forgive me, Inspector. A half-wit's work. Whoever stitched that had never been taught tension." "Then perhaps a younger hand," said Purbright. "Thank you, Miss Teal." He rose. "You've been most helpful. I fear your reputation for embroidery will now enter the official record." As they left, Love said quietly, "That's one T crossed off, sir." "Possibly," Purbright answered. "But embroidery leaves patterns whether or not the cloth survives." They were halfway across the square when Councillor Beamish hailed them from the doorway of his shop. "Inspector, you've dropped something." He waved an envelope. Inside was a folded sheet torn from a ledger, covered in his blunt scrawl. "Found this on my counter after you left yesterday. Thought it was mine, but no, it's that headmaster's handwriting. Recognized it from all those minutes he used to send us. Must have fallen out of his papers when he lent me the pen." Purbright unfolded the sheet. It contained a list of names, teachers, most of them, with notations beside each. Reconsider, approve, omit. At the bottom, in smaller script, the word midnight followed by a question mark. "So he was drawing up a list of those to be kept or dismissed," said Love, "and wondering if he'd finish it by midnight." "Or meet someone about it at midnight," said Purbright. "Perhaps our headmaster was not entirely master of his own list." That afternoon he called again on the grammar school. Mr. Crabbe received him in a flutter of paper. "You've heard, of course," Crabbe said eagerly. "The governors have decided to appoint an interim head. Terrible to have this cloud hanging. The press telephoned twice. Impertinent people." Purbright ignored the anxiety for dignity that often disguised relief. "Mr. Crabbe, when did you last see this list?" He laid the sheet on the desk. Crabbe stared. "Why? That's his staff, revision draft. He showed it me Monday, said he might alter it. It caused some, unrest. Those marked omit weren't best pleased. Would Mrs. Hesketh have seen it?" "Possibly. Her husband's name was on it." Purbright's gaze drifted to the inkstand again. "Blue-black ink?" "Yes, always. He said black ink was morbid and blue alone frivolous." "Did anyone else use this ink?" "Only me," said Crabbe, "and perhaps the secretaries. There was a bottle in the stationery cupboard, if you'd care to look." Purbright did. The cupboard smelled of paper and economies. On the lower shelf, beside a stack of blotting pads, stood an uncapped ink bottle, half empty. The rim bore a faint crystalline crust. He sniffed cautiously. Behind the familiar tang of ink lurked something sharper, like almonds whispering beneath a choir of chemicals. He replaced the bottle gently. "Mr. Crabbe, do you recall whether Mr. Pettifer refilled his pen that evening?" Crabbe hesitated. "He came in for his briefcase just before leaving. He may have done. He was always punctual about his pen." Back in the square, Purbright said, "We may at last have found the convenience that replaced a cup of tea. Cyanide in the ink, Sergeant. Ingenious, precise and tidy. You refill a pen, write your list, lick your finger to smudge a blot, and oblivion follows." Love looked appalled. "But who'd do that, sir?" "Someone who had access to his desk and his grievances," said Purbright. "The hand that arranged this believed in justice with punctuation." "Crabbe, then?" "Perhaps. He had both motive and keys. Yet his anxiety rings genuine, and he has survived too many meetings to mistake remorse for opportunity." Purbright stopped, considering the pattern that was taking shape. "No, Sergeant. I suspect someone who found being omitted intolerable, and who knew that a man like Pettifer would never change his ink, only his mind." The church clock struck 4, loud and prim. Purbright looked up at its face and smiled faintly. Midnight may have been the meeting that never happened, because death was punctual instead. "We shall invite the living to keep the appointment in his place." "Who, sir?" "Mrs. Hesketh, Mr. Crabbe, Miss Teal, and Councillor Beamish, for his memory of feathers. We'll have them all at the church hall tonight. Let us see which of them arrives early, and which cannot bear to watch the clock strike 12. The rain that evening seemed to have rehearsed its part. It fell with just enough insistence to keep people brisk and thoughtful as they crossed the square. Inside the church hall, the air was warm and faintly damp, carrying the scent of floor polish and dusted hymnals. Inspector Purbright stood near the front, apparently absorbed in straightening the stack of chairs, while Sergeant Love wrestled with the urn. The invitation to a brief discussion regarding the late Mr. Pettifer's affairs had been issued with a careful vagueness that encouraged attendance from those with both curiosity and conscience. Mrs. Hesketh arrived first. Her raincoat was dark, her expression lighter than it had been the previous day, as though decision had brought relief. She nodded at Purbright with the faint smile of someone determined to face what she could not avoid. "I came because you asked," she said. "Not because I have anything more to say." "That's often the best reason," Purbright replied gently. "People who come to say less usually end up saying more." Miss Teal entered next, a knitted hat drawn firmly over her iron-grey curls. "If this is a reconstruction," she said briskly, "I do hope someone will remember the biscuits. The last time I fainted in this hall was from hunger, not drama." She stationed herself near the heater and eyed Mrs. Hesketh with professional curiosity. Councillor Beamish followed, rubbing his hands together as though to generate moral warmth. "Inspector," he boomed, "if this is about the raffle permit, I assure you my accounts are spotless. Though, mind you, Pettifer's death did rather put a dent in the pavilion roof fund." "Your accounts are spotless, Councillor," said Purbright. "It is the ink that concerns us." Mr. Crabbe came last, damp and pale, his spectacles fogged with self-importance and fear. He made a little bow to Mrs. Hesketh, ignored Miss Teal, and murmured to Purbright, "I cannot imagine how I can help, but of course I'm willing." "Excellent," said Purbright, closing the door. "I prefer a full house when I explain a puzzle. It saves repetition." They were all seated now. Crabbe fidgeting, Beamish sniffing, Miss Teal watchful, Mrs. Hesketh still as stone. The clock over the stage read 8:30. Outside, rain traced a slow pulse against the windows. Purbright spoke in the mild, almost apologetic tone that in Flaxborough usually preceded an arrest. "You see, it puzzled me from the start that Mr. Pettifer, a man so precise he ironed his lecture notes, should die of a mess. Cyanide, so crude, so theatrical. Yet the means were delicate, the opportunity almost invisible. Until I realized that it depended not on what he ate or drank, but on what he wrote." Crabbe blinked rapidly. "Wrote?" "Indeed," Purbright continued. "His ink was poisoned. Someone replaced the contents of his bottle with a mixture that smelled faintly of almonds. Something Miss Teal noticed, though she quite properly attributed it to confectionery rather than chemistry." Miss Teal straightened. "Good heavens, you mean that when Pettifer refilled his pen, he also refilled his fate?" Purbright said. "He would, as always, have licked his finger to test a line or blot a smudge. That small, neat gesture was his undoing. A deadly habit, if you'll forgive the expression." Beamish made a low whistle. "Ingenious, that. And frightfully sneaky. I never trusted ink. It stains." "The act required access," Purbright went on. "The poison had to be introduced quietly, in Pettifer's study or the stationery cupboard. There one person came and went freely, unsupervised. One person who, by his own account, shared the same ink supply." Crabbe's lips parted, then closed again. "Are you suggesting—" "I am observing," said Purbright, "that you had both motive and means. You knew the list of redundancies, and your name might have been moved to the wrong column." "That's absurd," Crabbe burst out. "He trusted me." "Yes," Purbright said softly. "Enough to let you fetch the ink." The silence that followed was disturbed only by the faint hissing of the heater. Mrs. Hesketh's gaze had not moved from Crabbe. Miss Teal's needles clicked once in her pocket, though she was not knitting. Beamish cleared his throat with pious unease. Crabbe's voice came again, higher now, cracked at the edge. "I didn't touch the ink. Why would I risk everything? He was my friend." "Friendship," said Purbright, is an arrangement built on timetables and disappointments. You might have hoped to preserve both." He turned slightly, not to Crabbe but to Mrs. Hesketh. "However, there is one difficulty. The bottle we examined was not his usual brand. It had been refilled with another, one sold only by low-status chemist and purchased 2 days before the meeting by a woman signing herself Mrs. T. Hesketh." Mrs. Hesketh's hand tightened on her bag, but her face remained expressionless. "I assume," Purbright went on, "that the T stands for Thelma, and that you bought it to replace an empty bottle in your husband's desk, or perhaps to deliver a message." "I bought ink," she said quietly. "For my husband, not for murder. He'd run out. Mr. Pettifer told him to bring essays marked in blue-black, not turquoise. So yes, I bought it, but it was sealed." "Sealed when you purchased it, yes," Purbright agreed, "but unsealed when found. Someone opened it before it reached the school." All eyes turned to Crabbe again, whose color now resembled wet chalk. Purbright let the silence stretch before continuing, softly. "You see, the headmaster's timetable was not the only thing interrupted. The clock in this hall stopped that night at 17 minutes past 8. It stopped because someone climbed on a chair to adjust it, leaving a smudge of blue-black ink on the casing. That someone used the same ink before the lecture began. And that someone's initials, conveniently enough, are stitched in the glove found beneath the radiator." Crabbe whispered. Thomas Crabbe," said Purbright gently. "The glove is yours, not Miss Teal's. A gift from your sister, perhaps, when she still believed you a gentleman. The thread matches the ink that stained your desk pad. You took the replacement bottle from Mrs. Hesketh's parcel, poured your own mixture into it, and placed it back on Pettifer's shelf. You intended, I suspect, only to frighten him, a gesture of retribution for years of petty humiliation. You could not have known how swiftly cyanide persuades the body to be still." Crabbe's head fell into his hands. "He was going to dismiss me," he said hoarsely. "After 30 years, said I was obsolete, that my moral tone was out of step. He used that word, Inspector, obsolete." "I imagine he regretted it," Purbright murmured. Love stepped forward quietly, laying a hand on Crabbe's shoulder as if steadying a hymn book. "I'm afraid you'll have to come with us, sir." Crabbe rose without protest, a man relieved to find a conclusion. Mrs. Hesketh looked away, her face pale but unreadable. Miss Teal exhaled, long and slow. Beamish, after an awkward cough, murmured that it was a mercy to have it settled. "Settled," Purbright repeated, glancing up at the newly mended clock as it struck 9. "Yes, councillor, though I imagine the town will go on retelling it until it improves." Outside, the rain had eased to a drizzle fine as smoke. Purbright lingered by the door, watching Crabbe's figure guided into the police corps. Love returned with a sigh of damp authority. "Do you think he meant to kill him, sir?" Purbright considered, then shook his head. "No, but intention is a polite distinction. Flaxborough will sleep better calling it murder." He buttoned his coat. "Come along, Sergeant. We've an ink bottle to label and a town to reassure. Both, I think, will dry overnight." The following morning broke with a brittle, uncertain light, as though the town itself were reluctant to begin again. Flaxborough had a habit of treating tragedy as a local inconvenience, to be folded away among the milk deliveries and the parish notices. By 9 o'clock, shopkeepers were already retelling the tale with fresh embroidery. Some had seen Crabbe led away in handcuffs, others insisted he had confessed in tears, and 1 or 2 claimed the inspector himself had been moved to sermonize on the dangers of modern ink. Purbright, reading the morning edition over his porridge, noted the newspaper's modest headline, "Schoolmaster charged in poison case," and sighed faintly. In Flaxborough, even murder preferred discretion. At the station, Sergeant Love was radiant with the solemn satisfaction of a man whose world briefly makes sense. "It's all tidy now, sir," he declared. "Crabbe signed the statement. Said everything you said he would. Case closed, if ever one was. Purbright stirred his tea, watching the pale ring form around the spoon. Tidy, yes, he said absently. And yet, Sergeant, there are few things in this town less trustworthy than a tidy ending. Love looked uncertain. You don't think he's innocent, surely? The ink, the glove, the motive, all there in black and blue. Oh, he did something foolish, Purbright agreed. He tampered, perhaps as we supposed. But murderers of Crabbe's sort tend to leave more doubt in others than in themselves. He confessed because it was expected. What concerns me is that we are too content to believe him. Love frowned, the notion settling uneasily in his solid frame. But if not him, who else? Purbright smiled faintly. That, Sergeant, is the question we reserve for later. For now, we must see what our confession conceals. He rose, reaching for his coat. Fetch your notebook. We shall pay another call at the grammar school. The corridors were quieter than before, muffled by the respectability that follows scandal. A few boys loitered near the cloakroom, whispering names like they were magic spells. Crabbe, Pettifer, poison, each word uttered with the relish of discovery. Mr. Crabbe's classroom stood locked and dim, the blackboard still bearing the last unfinished exercise. Identify the moral implications. Mrs. Plummer, the secretary, met them with the defiance of one who had endured too many questions. If you've come to ask about the ink again, Inspector, I can assure you the cupboard has been scrubbed within an inch of its life. We are all quite purified. I admire efficiency, said Purbright, but perhaps not at the expense of evidence. May we look in Mr. Pettifer's office again? She hesitated, then nodded and led them down the corridor. The room was much as before, tidy, still haunted by the faint smell of paper and polish. On the desk sat a new bottle of ink, dutifully provided by the county council, and beside it a small brass key. Purbright picked it up. The cupboard key, Mrs. Plummer explained. Found in the vestry. No one knew who'd left it there. Purbright turned the key in his hand. Strange place for a key to rest, unless someone borrowed it for convenience. Everyone borrows things in a school, she said with mild contempt. It's practically the curriculum. Indeed. And did Mr. Pettifer lock this office himself on Wednesday evening? Oh yes, I saw him do it. He was particular about that, especially after the governor's files went missing last month. Missing? Purbright's tone was mild, but his eyes lifted sharply. Just a temporary misplacement, she said hastily. They turned up in the caretaker's cupboard. No harm done. Purbright set the key down. Thank you, Mrs. Plummer. You've been wonderfully consistent. Consistent? She echoed, faintly affronted. It is the sincerest form of accuracy, Purbright said, smiling. Back outside, Love muttered. She's hiding something, sir. Of course she is, Purbright replied. It's the only way some people keep their shape. He paused at the school gate, looking toward the church tower. The key, the cupboard, and those files. 3 things that wander only when guided. I think our late headmaster was less a victim of indignation than of administration. Love blinked. Meaning that school records, like reputations, can be rewritten. Perhaps Mr. Pettifer discovered a draft not to his liking. They returned to the station just as the telephone rang. Purbright answered, listening with quiet attentiveness, then replaced the receiver. That was the laboratory, he said. The ink bottle found in Pettifer's study contained traces of cyanide, yes, but so does the ink from the school stationery cupboard. Every bottle in the set. Love stared. All of them? Then anyone could have. Exactly. Someone made sure the ink supply itself was poisoned, which means Mr. Crabbe was not the target at all, merely the proof of method. The sergeant's mouth opened, then closed again. But who'd go to all that trouble? What for? Purbright smiled faintly, the expression one of melancholy amusement. to ensure the right person died without revealing who poured the bottle. Pettifer's death may have been intended to look like his own fault, a little morality lesson gone wrong. And who better to plan that than someone who understood paperwork, order, and how to appear indispensable? Love's brow furrowed. Mrs. Plummer? Possibly. Or perhaps someone standing just behind her, invisible as punctuation. He moved to the window, looking out at the market stalls beginning their afternoon retreat. There is one more oddity, Sergeant. The glove with the T. We assumed the letter marked ownership. But what if it marked a reminder? T for Tuesday, the day she delivered the ink to the headmaster's shelf. Secretaries live by such systems. Love scratched his head. She could have done it. Had access to everything, but why kill him? What's the motive, sir? Purbright turned from the window. In Flaxborough, motives are rarely grand. Pettifer was revising his staff list. We found that draft, but he was also revising the accounts, the governor's funds for school improvements. Suppose he discovered discrepancies, small enough to hide in arithmetic, large enough to end a career. Love's eyes widened. You think she was stealing? I think, said Purbright, that she borrowed, and when one borrows from a man who values honesty as policy, one must be sure he never balances the books. He reached for his hat. Fetch Miss Teal, Sergeant. She has eyes sharp enough for embroidery. If I am right, she saw more that night than she realized, and perhaps remembers the face behind that feathered hat Councillor Beamish described. Love hesitated. You still mean to hold the meeting at the hall? Indeed, Purbright said. It worked well the first time. Only this time I expect a rather quieter ending. Our murderer has already written one confession in invisible ink. Let us see whether she can resist signing another. They stepped into the fading afternoon. The church clock began its slow, deliberate striking. Each chime seemed to fold the day into narrower shadows. Purbright, glancing up at it, murmured, Midnight was the hour Mr. Pettifer feared. Perhaps, Sergeant, that is when truth prefers to keep its appointments. By late afternoon, the square had emptied into its usual melancholy quiet, the rain polishing the cobbles until the lamplight shimmered like liquid brass. Purbright, walking with the unhurried gait of a man who never chased answers, but waited for them to approach, crossed to the church hall once more. The door creaked open obligingly, as if accustomed to confession. Inside, the familiar odor of damp hymn books and polish greeted him. He stood for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the clock that now kept better time than most consciences in Flaxborough. Sergeant Love followed, clutching his notebook as though afraid the truth might try to escape through its pages. Miss Teal's on her way, sir. Said she'd just finished bottling her wintergreen before she came. I didn't dare ask what that meant. Prudent, said Purbright. People like Miss Teal derive their courage from order. To interrupt would be an act of moral vandalism. They set a small table near the dais where Pettifer had delivered his last speech. Purbright laid out a few objects with careful indifference, the silver-capped vial, the glove, the ink bottle, and the timetable note reading midnight. Don't delay. Each item looked faintly embarrassed to have survived its purpose. The door opened. Miss Teal entered briskly, wrapped in her habitual scent of camphor and propriety. Inspector, I do hope this isn't another of those psychological experiments, she said, eyeing the display. I've always believed the human mind works best when left alone. Quite, Purbright said. I merely hoped you might indulge a small test of recollection. Miss Teal removed her gloves, folded them, and sat. Recollection is my speciality. What do you wish to know? When you attended the lecture, said Purbright, you were near the front. You saw Mr. Pettifer drop his notes. You saw the vial roll beneath the table. Did you by any chance see who retrieved it? Miss Teal frowned. No one did. I told you. The Reverend prevented me. But wait. Her eyes narrowed. Now you mention it. Someone brushed past me. A woman. I remember because her sleeve left a mark on my cardigan. Powdery, like chalk. She bent down, rather quickly, before I'd quite risen. I thought she was helping, but she moved on at once. Would you recognize her? Miss Teal's lips pursed. She had that sort of posture one associates with school secretaries. Tallish, decisive, wearing a hat. Yes, with a feather. Brown. Mrs. Plummer's hat, Purbright murmured. Precisely, Miss Teal said, looking pleased with herself. And if I may add, her perfume was very definite, not the sort for church. Purbright smiled. You've been invaluable, Miss Teal. Your attention to scent may yet improve our understanding of human nature. She gave a small, dignified nod, as though accepting an academic citation. When she had gone, Love let out a long breath. That settles it then. Mrs. Plummer, she poisoned the ink, fetched the vial, and left the rest to tidy itself up. Purbright regarded the table thoughtfully. Yes, and like all good secretaries, she filed her murder under routine correspondence. We must invite her to amend the record. They found Mrs. Plummer at home in a neat semi-detached on the edge of town, where the curtains were drawn just enough to suggest grief without untidiness. She opened the door wearing an expression midway between curiosity and annoyance. Inspector, again? You people do lead busy lives. Only when others cease to, Purbright said pleasantly. Might we come in? I should like to return a key. She hesitated, then admitted them to a sitting room that smelled faintly of furniture polish and self-control. On the sideboard stood a photograph of Mr. Pettifer, smiling in the pained manner of men posing at school functions. I understand you found this key, Purbright said, placing it on the table. The cupboard key. It was in the vestry, you said. That's right, she replied. I handed it in to Mr. Crabbe. Why? Because it was the key to your cupboard, Mrs. Plummer. Not his. Her composure faltered, a hairline crack across porcelain. That's nonsense. Not entirely, Purbright said mildly. We checked the teeth. It opens both cupboards, the stationery and the office files. Convenient for someone who needed to exchange a bottle unnoticed. She folded her arms, an attempt at defiance that only looked weary. You're mistaken, Inspector. I'd no reason to harm Mr. Pettifer. On the contrary, said Purbright, you had two. One financial, those governor's funds you borrowed in anticipation of reimbursement. The other emotional, a certain loyalty he no longer reciprocated. He was going to expose both in his report to the Education Committee. You found that draft in the files you so carefully misplaced. Mrs. Plummer's face whitened, but her voice stayed steady. You've no proof. I have the proof of method, Purbright replied. You ordered new ink for the term. You collected it personally. You also purchased a small quantity of potassium cyanide from low staters, signed under the pretext of wasp extermination. When the bottles arrived, you refilled one with your mixture and placed it in Pettifer's office, certain he would use it before the lecture. He did. What you did not expect was that the school clock, having stopped once that night, would preserve the time of your visit. He took a folded slip from his pocket. The caretaker remembered you coming at 6:30, long before the audience arrived. Said you wanted to check the chairs. You carried a bag. I imagine it squeaked, as leather sometimes does when nervous. Mrs. Plummer sank into her chair. Her voice, when it came, was small and dry. He was going to ruin me. I begged him to delay the report, to give me time to repay the money. He refused. Said the truth couldn't be postponed. She looked up with sudden bitterness. He was wrong. I postponed it very neatly. Purbright inclined his head. For a time, yes. But the truth, Mrs. Plummer, is an untidy lodger. It turns up uninvited. Love shifted uneasily, as though the weight of pity pressed too close to justice. You'll need to come with us, madam, he said gently. She nodded, the fight gone. I expect so. There's a letter in my bureau. I wrote it last night. It says almost everything." When she was escorted out, Purbright lingered a moment. The room, stripped of its owner's poise, seemed oddly bare. He looked again at Pettifer's photograph, the rigid smile, the stiff collar, the moral certainty. "You might have forgone your principles just once, my friend," he murmured. "They seem to have cost you rather dearly." Outside, the dusk had thickened into fog, muffling the town's narrow streets. Love waited by the car, glancing back toward the lit doorway. "So it was her all along," he said quietly. "And Crab'll walk free." "In due course," Purbright said. "He'll return to his chalk and timetables and find both less forgiving, but he'll be alive, which is a useful start." He paused, watching the street lamps dissolve into the mist. Flaxborough will gossip for a week, then fold this neatly into its history. Murder here is just another form of civic duty, performed without enthusiasm. They drove on through the quiet town, past shuttered shops and the church spire lost in cloud. Somewhere, a clock struck 7, its chime absorbed by the fog. Purbright listened, then smiled faintly. "Midnight came early for Mr. Pettifer," he said, "but at least the lesson was punctual." The next day, Flaxborough presented itself as though nothing had happened. The shops opened at their habitual hours, milk bottles clinked at the doors, and the postman whistled an optimistic air that convinced no one. Yet beneath that deliberate ordinariness, something hung suspended, a sense that decency had been slightly rearranged. Mrs. Plummer's arrest had entered the local bloodstream not as shock, but as confirmation of something the town already suspected about itself. That virtue, like wallpaper, could hide a number of unsightly cracks if one kept the lights low. Inspector Purbright, never given to celebration, spent the morning clearing the clutter from his desk. He found among the papers the note that had begun it all. Midnight. Don't delay. He turned it over in his hand thoughtfully, as though it might yet yield an extra syllable of meaning. Sergeant Love entered with a file and the kind of cautious cheerfulness reserved for good news delivered to a weary superior. "She's admitted it, sir," Love said. "Everything. The money, the ink, even the bottle in the hall. Said she never meant him to die so soon, only to give him what she called a night of reflection. Claims she misjudged the quantity." Purbright raised his eyes. "They often do, Sergeant. Murderers and cooks share that failing. Misjudging the quantity." He placed the note in the drawer, closed it, and leaned back. "Did she mention the letter she spoke of last night?" "Yes, sir. It's in her own handwriting. Starts with, 'To whom it may concern,' as though she were opening correspondence, not closing a life. She says she did it alone." "Of course she does," said Purbright softly. "They always insist on ownership once the cost is certain." He looked out at the square, where the lamplighter was testing the new electric switch. "Still, there's something missing, isn't there? Something that won't quite fold away." Love frowned, riffling through his notes. "We've got the ink, the motive, the confession. What more can there be?" Purbright's tone was mild, almost amused. "Only the reason she left that note. Midnight. Don't delay. It wasn't written to herself, nor to Mr. Pettifer. It was addressed to someone else." Love's brow furrowed deeper. "You think she had an accomplice?" "Not in the sense of partnership, no. But perhaps in the sense of persuasion. People rarely commit tidy crimes without encouragement. A kind word here, a sympathetic listener there. It's astonishing how morality can be bent if spoken to kindly enough." He reached for his hat. "Let's pay a visit to the King's Arms, Sergeant. There's a sort of truth that only sits comfortably behind a glass of sherry." The pub was quiet at midday, smelling faintly of beer mats and disapproval. The landlady looked up from polishing the counter. "You'll be wanting your usual tea, Inspector. Or something stronger, seeing as your case is all wrapped up." "Tea, thank you," Purbright said. and perhaps a moment of your memory. Do you recall Mrs. Plummer being here lately? Tuesday evening, perhaps?" The landlady frowned in concentration. "Her? Oh, yes. Came in for a short time. Sat with Mrs. Hesketh, of all people. Odd pair, those two. Mrs. Plummer said she wanted to speak about the school accounts, but it wasn't accounts they were whispering about, I'll tell you that. She looked flustered, and Mrs. Hesketh, well, she looked triumphant. I remember thinking something had changed hands." "What sort of thing?" "An envelope, I think. Mrs. Hesketh slipped it into her bag quick enough." Purbright nodded slowly. "Thank you. You've been as observant as ever." Outside, Love exhaled a puzzled sigh. "But Mrs. Hesketh's out of it now, isn't she? She had nothing to do with the ink." "Perhaps not with the ink," said Purbright, "but perhaps with the encouragement." He began walking toward the river, his voice low and meditative. "Consider it, Sergeant. 2 women wronged by the same man in different ways. One dismissed her husband, the other about to lose her livelihood. Resentment is often solitary, but when it finds companionship, it grows bold." They found Mrs. Hesketh at home again. Her piano lid closed this time, as if mourning had been imposed upon it. She received them without surprise. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said. "Then you won't mind if we don't take long," said Purbright. "You met Mrs. Plummer on Tuesday night. You gave her something, an envelope." Her smile was faint but unrepentant. "I gave her proof, Pettifer's little letter confirming my husband's redundancy. She wanted it for her file, said she could make use of it, that she could make him see reason." "And did she?" "She thought she did," Mrs. Hesketh said softly. "I didn't ask how. It wasn't my business." Purbright regarded her with quiet interest. "You seem remarkably calm, Mrs. Hesketh." "I am," she said. "He humiliated my husband and bullied everyone beneath him. If she hadn't done it, someone else would have. Pettifer brought about his own death the way pompous men often do, by never learning to listen." Love bristled. "You're talking about murder, ma'am." She looked at him, her expression faintly pitying. "You're talking about law, Sergeant. They're rarely the same conversation." Purbright said nothing for a moment. He simply observed her, the way a cat studies a half-open cupboard. Finally, he said, "Mrs. Plummer says she acted alone. I shall let her keep that dignity, but if you ever feel inclined to clarify the truth, I should prefer to hear it before the newspapers do." "I have no reason to clarify anything, Inspector. It's all finished." "Finished?" Purbright repeated gently. "Perhaps, though sometimes the end is only the point at which gossip takes over for fact." He tipped his hat. "Good evening, Mrs. Hesketh." As they left, Love muttered, "She's as guilty as sin." "Possibly," Purbright said. "But guilt, like perfume, lingers longer on some than on others. We'll leave it to conscience, Flaxborough's least reliable policeman." They walked back through the dimming streets, the lamps coming on one by one like cautious eyes. Love finally spoke. "You'll still charge her, won't you?" Purbright smiled faintly. "No, Sergeant. The law requires proof, not instinct, and besides, Mrs. Plummer's story will satisfy the town's appetite for morality. To expose another culprit would only spoil their digestion." Love looked troubled, but said nothing more. The station clock struck 5 as they entered, its sound soft but exact. Purbright paused at his desk, glancing once more at the drawer where the note lay hidden. "Midnight," he murmured. "It wasn't an appointment. It was a warning. Don't delay indeed." He turned to Love. "You'll see to Mrs. Plummer's transfer in the morning, and then perhaps we shall all resume our lessons in morality, those that begin precisely at midnight and end, as usual, too late." The following days slipped past with the unhurried rhythm of a town easing itself back into denial. Flaxborough's appetite for scandal was brisk but shallow. Once satisfied, it turned its gaze back to the safer nourishment of garden fetes and bus timetables. Yet, for Inspector Purbright, satisfaction remained a stranger. Each morning, he arrived at the station to find new affirmations of closure, statements typed, reports filed, the administrative rituals that pass for certainty. He completed them all with his usual care, though in his mind he was still tracing the edges of something unsaid, a shape in the story that refused to stay still. It was Thursday when the post arrived, later than usual, and with it an envelope marked "Private to Inspector Purbright." The handwriting was careful, the ink faintly blue-black, the paper of the same heavy stock used by the grammar school. He opened it slowly, aware before he began that the neatness of the script would not comfort him. "Inspector," it read, "I wish to make plain that I did not act alone, nor did I act entirely from fear. When I tampered with the ink, it was at another's suggestion, one made with such subtlety that it scarcely felt criminal, only just. She convinced me that it would frighten him, delay his report, and give us both time. I see now that she wished him dead. If my courage had been less, perhaps I would have noticed her intention. If my conscience had been more, perhaps I would have stopped myself. But courage and conscience are rarely punctual. I trust you will read this in private. There is no need for further shame. E. Plummer." Purbright folded the letter carefully, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he rose, coat already in hand. "Sergeant," he said as he passed Love's desk, "fetch your hat. We're going visiting again." "Mrs. Hesketh?" Love guessed, already half out of his chair. Purbright's silence was enough of an answer. They walked through the brittle afternoon, the air thin and still as if holding its breath. The Hesketh house looked unchanged, curtains drawn, piano silent, but there was something in its stillness that struck Purbright as rehearsed. He knocked once, then again. No reply. Love peered through the glass. "Looks empty, sir." "Not quite," said Purbright quietly. The faintest curl of smoke rose from the chimney. He tried the door. It opened. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and something sharper. Ammonia, perhaps. On the piano lay a single sheet of paper weighted by a metronome. Purbright lifted it. "To Inspector Purbright. By the time you read this, I shall have gone somewhere quieter than Flaxborough allows. You were right, of course. I did encourage her. I told her there were ways to make a man pause without ending him, that a little fear might restore justice where it had been mislaid. She lacked imagination, that was all. I suppose I owe her that death. You may think this cowardice, but it is only consistency." Pettifer prided himself on teaching moral lessons. "Consider this mine." Purbright read it twice, then looked toward the kitchen door. "Stay here, Sergeant," he said quietly. He crossed the threshold and stopped. Mrs. Hesketh sat upright in a chair beside the table, her hands folded in her lap as if awaiting an examination result. On the table before her, a glass lay tipped, the residue inside unmistakably white. Her face was calm, almost serene, as though she had finally conducted her own final movement. Love's voice came softly from the doorway. "She's—" "Yes," Purbright said. "Dead." They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the ticking of the metronome still marking time on the piano, its small metal arms swinging obediently between guilt and resignation. Finally, Purbright reached out and stopped it with one finger. Later, at the station, after the doctor's report and the paperwork that followed death like an undertaker's shadow, Love said, "It doesn't seem fair, sir. Mrs. Plummer in a cell, this one gone, and Pettifer, well, he's the reason for the lot of it. It's like everyone's punished except the one who started it." Purbright gave a small, weary smile. "Fairness, Sergeant, is a luxury Flaxborough has never afforded. We prefer balance, quieter, less conspicuous, and far more permanent." He took out Mrs. Hesketh's note again and placed it beside Mrs. Plummer's confession. "Two women," he said softly, "both bound by the same man's certainties. Pettifer would have approved of the symmetry. Love leaned on the desk, his voice hesitant. You think she planned it that way, sir? All along? Purbright shook his head. No. I think she only realized what she'd set in motion once it was too late to stop. She told Mrs. Plummer to frighten him. But fear, once given a form, often develops ambitions of its own. Pettifer died because he was too proud to imagine ordinary malice. Mrs. Plummer acted because she was too frightened not to. And Mrs. Hesketh, she was merely tidy, couldn't bear loose ends. He rose, walking to the window. Outside, the evening was folding itself over the town, the lights in the square flickering to life one by one. That's Flaxborough's tragedy, Sergeant. Not wickedness, just a preference for completion. Love said nothing. He was staring at the metronome Purbright had brought back and set upon his desk. Its polished brass winked faintly in the lamplight. You keeping that, sir? For a while, Purbright said. It's a reminder. Every investigation, every truth, begins with movement and ends when someone decides they've kept time long enough. He reached forward and set it swinging again, the tiny beat steady and unhurried. We'll send Mrs. Plummer's letter to the Crown Office. She'll have her trial, though it will make little difference to the living. Love nodded slowly. And what about you, sir? You satisfied now? Purbright's eyes followed the metronome's pendulum. Satisfied? He echoed. No, Sergeant, but then satisfaction's only the ghost of curiosity, and I prefer my ghosts to keep busy. As the clock struck 6, the sound mingled with the metronome's tick until both seemed one patient, inevitable rhythm. Outside, the town's windows glowed against the darkening sky, each square of light another small insistence that life, whatever else it may be, must go on being ordinary. Purbright, still watching the steady motion on his desk, murmured almost to himself, Midnight's come and gone, but lessons, it seems, are never quite over. The following Monday dawned cold and clear, the kind of brittle autumn morning that made Flaxborough look briefly noble. From the police station window, the roofs shone with frost, chimneys smoking like quiet confessions. Inspector Purbright sat alone at his desk, the last report spread before him in perfect order, though his expression suggested the paperwork had long since stopped being the real work. Mrs. Plummer had been transferred to Lincoln Jail 2 days earlier, her trial to follow once the magistrates had enjoyed the full dignity of delay. The newspapers had been decorous, even compassionate. Devoted school secretary driven to desperation. The phrase, Purbright thought, had the advantage of being both forgiving and saleable. Mrs. Hesketh's death, by contrast, was treated as a tragic coda, which was true enough, though the reporter had neglected to notice that the piece's rhythm ended not with grief, but with relief. Sergeant Love entered, stamping warmth back into his feet and carrying 2 cups of tea. Cold one, sir, he said. Town's gone quiet again. Almost cheerful about it, you might say. Flaxborough prides itself on its cheerful aftermaths, Purbright replied. He gestured to the second chair. Sit down, Sergeant. You've earned a few minutes of comfort. Love settled, blowing on his tea. I still keep thinking about them, sir, the 2 women. Hard to believe it all came from a bit of schooling. It rarely comes from the thing itself, said Purbright. It comes from what people imagine it means. Pettifer's ink was just a tool for marking other people's failings. Eventually, someone decided to mark his. Love was quiet for a while, then asked, Do you really think Mrs. Hesketh meant for him to die? Purbright took off his spectacles, folded them with deliberate care. I think she meant to teach him a lesson, her own kind of justice. But lessons are like fires, Sergeant. Once lit, they warm or they burn, and it's seldom the teacher who decides which. He leaned back, watching the faint curl of steam rise from his cup. The irony, of course, is that Pettifer never read her letter, the one she wanted him to. It was found in his briefcase, unopened. She wanted him to understand her grievance, but instead he took his understanding with him into eternity. Love grimaced. You'd think people would say what they mean while they've still got the time. They prefer implication, Purbright said dryly. It's less embarrassing and more durable. A knock interrupted them. Constable Garbett appeared, holding a small parcel. Came for you, sir. No return address. Purbright took it, unwrapping the plain paper. Inside was a pocket-sized metronome, newer than the one from the Hesketh house. A note accompanied it, written in the same careful, elegant script he recognized from Mrs. Plummer's confession. Inspector, I thought you might appreciate this. I had another, you see. I always admired the way it kept perfect time, however uneven the players. Please don't pity me. I've made my peace with proportion. E.P. Love frowned. She's still writing from prison. Bold, that. She always valued neatness, Purbright murmured. Even her remorse must be properly formatted. He turned the metronome over in his hands, wound it gently, and set it ticking. The sound was steady, unhurried, impossibly calm. It seems she wants to remind us that justice, like rhythm, must never lose its tempo. Love hesitated. Does it trouble you, sir? All of it, I mean. The way it ended? Purbright smiled faintly, eyes on the small pendulum swinging with serene indifference. Trouble me? No, Sergeant. Puzzles are not meant to trouble. They're meant to occupy. It's the people inside them who suffer. Ours was a small tragedy, well arranged, perfectly provincial. 2 women and 1 foolish man, all seeking justification. The town will digest it neatly. Love finished his tea, still thoughtful. So that's that, then. That's that, Purbright echoed softly. Until the next ordinary disaster arrives. It usually does. He rose and crossed to the window. Below, the square was already stirring. Mrs. Dewhurst arranging chrysanthemums at the florist's, Councillor Beamish sweeping his shop front with the energy of renewed innocence, and Miss Teal marching toward the post office, doubtless prepared to mail her version of events to someone she imagined cared. Flaxborough had returned to its natural rhythm, its gossip humming at the same frequency as its respectability. The headmaster's death, once the town's excitement, had now become a moral tale to be recited between knitting patterns and church raffles. Purbright turned back to his desk, the ticking metronome marking the seconds with gentle indifference. There's comfort in routine, Sergeant, he said, even for murder. Love smiled, weary but loyal. Do you ever tire of it, sir, the tidying up? Sometimes, said Purbright. But then I remember that chaos, left unattended, breeds committees. He reached for his pen, signing the last report with his usual tidy flourish. And those, Sergeant, are far more dangerous than poison. Outside, the church clock began to strike the hour, clear, resonant, punctual as ever. The sound filled the room for a moment, then faded, leaving only the soft ticking of the metronome and the faint shuffle of papers being set straight. Purbright glanced once more at the letter, then folded it into the case file. There, he said quietly. All in order. He extinguished the lamp, buttoned his coat, and walked out into the pale afternoon. The square smelled faintly of coal smoke and chrysanthemums, and somewhere in the distance a school bell rang, a thin, echoing sound that seemed both beginning and end. Inspector Purbright paused, adjusted his hat against the breeze, and moved on toward the station gate with the unhurried composure of a man who knew that truth, however late it arrived, would always find him waiting.